My name is Rachel Morgan, 36 years old, and on the day I thought I could simply watch my sister's wedding in peace, my father stood before 200 guests and demanded 40% of the estate I had built in the Maldives. In an instant, the ballroom became his courtroom. My sister by his side, their voices rising against me as if I were a criminal. The gasps, the whispers, the phones lifted to record, all pressed down heavier than any illness I had ever survived. But none of them knew the truth I carried that would turn their humiliation into his downfall. The chandeliers above the ballroom glittered in a golden haze, casting light across marble floors polished so clean they looked like glass. I slipped inside quietly, choosing a seat toward the back where I could watch without being noticed. Emily had always been the center of attention, and today she looked radiant floating down the aisle in her white gown, as if the entire city had gathered just to admire her. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering their admiration, their faces glowing with smiles meant only for her. I folded my hands in my lap, reminding myself this was her day, not mine, and I only needed to survive it in silence. The string quartet softened into a prelude. Reverend John cleared his throat and opened his Bible, his voice just beginning to rise when the scrape of a chair tore through the stillness. My father, Thomas Morgan, stood abruptly from the front row. His navy suit was crisp, his posture rigid, and his face carried the expression I had known my whole life, the one that warned me to brace for impact. His voice rang out sharp and commanding, cutting across the music and the Reverend's words. "Rachel, you will return 40% of the money from your Maldives property or else." For a moment the room froze. The musician stopped mid-note, the Reverend's mouth hung open, and the only sound was the shallow intake of breath from dozens of guests. Then the murmurs began, a wave of disbelief rolling through the room. Faces turned in my direction, some confused, some amused, some already judging. My skin burned beneath their stares. I wanted to believe I had misheard, but his finger was raised, pointing directly at me, his eyes locked in a cold challenge. There was no mistake. He had chosen this moment to put me on trial. Emily shifted her gown, brushing against the aisle runner as she walked with determined steps toward him. She slid to his side, her veil catching the light, her smile tight and deliberate. "Dad has every right to ask you, Rachel," she said sweetly enough for everyone to hear. "That money should not have been yours alone." Her words struck harder than the gasps around us. My own sister had joined him without hesitation, her voice confirming my isolation before hundreds of witnesses. Heat spread through my chest, and my pulse thudded against my ears. I searched for my mother, Linda, sitting primly in her silver dress a few rows ahead. Her eyes never lifted from the floor, her hands folded neatly as if pretending nothing was happening would make it disappear. I turned slightly, hoping to meet Mark's gaze from across the room. My husband's eyes found mine steady and supportive, but even he could not stop what had already begun. The whispers grew louder. People leaned in, hands covering their mouths, repeating fragments. "Did you hear what he said? Something about millions. Maybe she cheated them. Maybe she stole." A few phones lifted discreetly, guests trying to capture the spectacle, eager to share the drama beyond these walls. I pressed my nails into my palms until they stung, forcing myself to remain upright. I would not cry. I would not crumble in front of them. My father's voice boomed again, filling the silence between gossiping breaths. 40%, Rachel. Give it back to this family or face the consequences." His words echoed off the crystal and marble like a gavel slamming down. Emily lifted her chin, radiant in her certainty, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for, the one that proved she was the rightful heir to his approval. I stayed seated, every muscle tight, my breath shallow. Humiliation wrapped around me heavier than any illness I had ever endured. The man who should have been protecting me had turned my sister's wedding into his courtroom, with me as the accused and the guests as his jury. I could feel the judgment thick in the air, pressing against my shoulders like a weight I had carried my whole life. I lowered my eyes, forcing my expression calm, though inside I was burning. They thought they could strip me bare with public shame, but they had no idea what scars I already carried. nor how many years I had endured in silence. As the murmurs continued and my father stood tall in triumph, another sound rose inside me, quieter but stronger, the sound of memories long buried, clawing their way to the surface. Because this moment, as cruel as it was not new. It was only the loudest echo of a pattern I had known since childhood, a pattern of favoritism and dismissal that had defined my life. And sitting there, surrounded by whispers and pointing eyes, I felt the past rushing back with a force that promised the story was only beginning. I was 10 years old the first time I understood what it meant to be invisible in my own home. Emily had come home from school with a ribbon for placing third in a county spelling bee. My father lifted her into his arms like she had conquered the world, twirling her in the living room while my mother clapped along. I had been standing there with a report card full of straight A's, the kind I had worked for weeks to earn, but no one asked to see it. My father glanced at it briefly and said good job before turning back to Emily, his eyes shining only for her. That was the pattern, and it carved itself into my bones. As the years passed, the gap only widened. Emily was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. When she forgot her chores, my father laughed and told her she had too much on her plate. When I forgot, he called it laziness and told me I needed discipline. Emily wrecked her car at 16, and he bought her another within a month. I never had a car of my own. I took buses to school, to part-time jobs, to anywhere I needed to be, because there was no one waiting to hand me the keys. My mother, Linda, never spoke up. She would look at me with sad eyes, almost apologetic, but she never said a word to my father. Silence was her survival, and her silence left me standing alone. I learned not to expect anyone to step in on my behalf. I learned to carry my victories quietly, to swallow the sting of being overlooked, and to tell myself it did not matter as long as Emily was happy. I remember one Christmas in particular. I was 17, and I had just been accepted to a prestigious summer program in New York. I came to the dinner table, letter in hand, ready to share the news. Emily announced she had been cast in a minor role in a community theater production. My father raised his glass, toasted her brilliance, and spent the evening planning how he would invite neighbors to see her perform. My acceptance letter stayed folded in my pocket the whole night. No one asked, no one noticed. By dessert, I slipped away to my room, sat on the floor, and read the letter again in silence, whispering congratulations to myself. That was how I learned to measure worth in my family. Not by effort, not by achievement, but by who shone brightest in my father's eyes. Emily had sparkle charm, the kind of easy smile that drew people in. I had determination, long nights of studying the grit to keep moving forward. But grit does not glitter, and in my family, glitter was all that mattered. When I earned scholarships, I celebrated alone. When I was accepted into medical school, my father said nothing more than "it will be hard on you," and left the room. Emily, meanwhile, announced she was taking a marketing internship at a boutique agency, and he threw her a dinner party. The message was always the same. Her steps, no matter how small, were monumental. Mine, no matter how great, were ordinary. Sitting in that ballroom in Boston, his words cutting through the wedding ceremony, I felt the weight of all those years pressing down again. Emily standing at his side, her chin lifted in triumph, was not new. It was the continuation of every dinner table, every holiday, every moment, where I was told without words that I was less. And the guests who whispered and speculated now were simply an extension of the chorus that had followed me my entire life. My heart hammered with both shame and clarity. I had built my life without them. I had studied, worked, endured, and survived things Emily had never faced. I had faced down illness and stood back up. And still, here I was being cast as the problem child, the greedy one, the outcast who had to defend herself in front of strangers. The injustice of it made my stomach twist, but beneath that twist was something stronger, something I had not felt in years. Resolve. I lifted my head, meeting my father's glare across the room. He thought he had cornered me, that his public spectacle would crush me into silence the way it always had at home. But he did not know what I carried with me now. I had more than memories of being dismissed. I had proof I had strength, and I had no intention of letting him take what was mine. The whispers around me blurred as my mind sharpened. If this was the battlefield he had chosen, then I would fight differently this time. Because behind the humiliation and the noise, I knew something he did not. The papers in my purse could rewrite the script he had tried to control, and the reckoning he had feared was already on its way. I had worked for every dollar that allowed me to breathe without fear of losing everything. After finishing my residency shifts in the early mornings, I saved until my hands ached from charting, until I could no longer keep my eyes open. By 2019, I had scraped together enough to buy something I never thought possible, a small villa tucked on the edge of the Indian Ocean in the Maldives. It was modest compared to the luxury retreats that surrounded it, but to me, it was a palace. The white sand and turquoise waves were proof that my discipline had created something beautiful, a reward I had carved out with no help from anyone. When I signed the purchase contract, I remember holding the pen and feeling as though I had finally claimed a piece of the world that was mine. Not my father's, not Emily's, not granted by pity or favor, but earned. Every cent came from nights in the hospital, from research projects I squeezed in during weekends, from saying no to vacations and dinners with friends. I knew what sacrifice looked like, and that villa was the embodiment of it. By 2023, I sold it for $1.2 million. The market had soared, and with that sale, I secured a financial cushion that gave me peace for the first time. I planned to invest carefully to use it as a shield for the life I was building with Mark. I never flaunted it, never rubbed it in anyone's face. I simply tucked the documents into a folder and carried on with work proud and private, the way I had always been. But my father had other ideas. Months before the sale, he slipped a document across the table at a family dinner. His words were casual, almost rehearsed, as he told me it was just a power of attorney to help manage overseas accounts more smoothly. I read it carefully and saw exactly what it was. If I signed, he would have control over the property, the bank accounts, every future decision tied to that villa. I looked him in the eye, told him I would think about it, and later tucked the unsigned paper away. That night I realized he would never see me as independent. He would always view me as someone he had a right to control. When the sale went through, I could see the shift in his expression. He congratulated me with a stiff handshake, his smile thin. He asked questions about the bank transfer, about which accounts the money had landed in. I gave vague answers, already sensing that his interest had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with ownership. To him, my victory was simply another asset in the family's empire, something he believed should be shared, which in his mind meant taken. Now standing in the ballroom with the eyes of 200 guests pressing against me, I understood why he had chosen this stage. It was not enough to demand quietly behind closed doors. He wanted to shame me, to remind everyone that no matter how much I had built, he believed I was still under his command. Emily's siding with him only confirmed what I had always known. To them, my hard-won independence was nothing more than leverage, something to bend until it snapped. I touched the strap of my purse where the folder rested, the weight of it grounding me. Inside were the purchase agreements, the sale contracts, the email trail with international attorneys, every signature authentic, and mine alone. He could shout all he wanted about family rights and obligations, but the ink told another story. The truth was already sealed on paper, waiting for the moment I chose to reveal it. I inhaled slowly, my chest tight but steady. I could hear Mark shift slightly in his chair, his jaw clenched as he watched the scene unravel. My mother sat frozen, her face pale under the ballroom lights. The guests whispered louder, hungry for scandal, their voices rising in waves of speculation. They thought they were witnessing my undoing, but they did not know what I carried. As I gripped the purse tighter, I felt the familiar sting of years of dismissal twist into something sharper. This was no longer about money alone. It was about drawing a line that could not be crossed again. My father believed he still held the upper hand, but I had already chosen how this story would end, and when the moment came, I would not hesitate. And as I sat there with their accusations hanging heavy in the air, I realized the stage he had set for my humiliation could just as easily become the stage for his downfall. My father's voice boomed again louder this time, bouncing off the chandeliers and filling every corner of the ballroom. He called me ungrateful, accused me of selfishness of putting myself above the family that had given me everything. Each word struck like a hammer, deliberate and cruel, meant to break me down in front of the very people who were supposed to be celebrating love. Emily stepped forward, her veil trembling as she moved, her eyes locked on me with sharp disdain. She added her voice to his, saying, "I only thought of myself and never once cared about the family." The sting of her words pierced deeper than I expected, not because I believed them, but because she had chosen this moment to side so easily against me. I looked around, desperate for any sign of humanity. My mother sat rigid in her chair, her gaze lowered, her hands clenched together in her lap. She would not intervene. She never did. Michael the groom stood frozen near the altar, his face pale, caught between his new bride and the disaster unfolding. He looked as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. Around us, the guests leaned closer to one another, whispering with hungry fascination, their curiosity dripping from every sideways glance. A few phones were raised, cameras glowing faintly as they recorded the spectacle, each angle capturing my humiliation for replay later. My cousin Anna, sitting 3 tables away, lifted her phone slowly, her face unreadable as she pressed record. I could almost feel the lens on me, framing my silence for the world to see. The walls of the ballroom seemed to close in the air, heavy with judgment. I felt like prey in the center of a circle, surrounded by predators waiting for me to collapse. My father continued repeating his demand, emphasizing that I had betrayed the family, painting me as a greedy daughter who had abandoned her roots. His words were calculated, each one designed to draw the crowd to his side. Emily nodded at every sentence, her lips curling into a satisfied smile, feeding on the validation she believed she was owed. Their unity against me was suffocating, as if I had been erased from the family tree right there in front of strangers. But I did not cry. I did not rise to shout or storm out. I pressed my palms against my knees, grounding myself, feeling the fabric of my dress dig into my skin. I forced my breathing to slow to steady. I knew what they wanted. They wanted to see me shatter, to confirm their narrative that I was fragile, undeserving, and weak. Instead, I let the silence wrap around me. Every second I stayed quiet, every moment I refused to break the tension in the room grew tighter, sharper. The whispers swelled, then hushed again, as people waited hungry for my reaction. Even the musicians sat frozen, their instruments limp in their hands. I turned my eyes toward Emily, and for the first time that night, I looked at her without flinching. Her face glowed with triumph, her body angled toward our father like his loyal soldier. I thought of all the years I had carried her burdens, quietly had sacrificed so she could shine. And now, here she stood, tearing me down as though none of it had ever mattered. My stomach twisted, but beneath it I felt a spark of something steady, almost electric. I was not powerless, not tonight. The hum of a phone vibrated faintly on a table nearby. A guest shifted uncomfortably, glancing between me and my father, as though questioning what side they should take. I caught Anna's eyes briefly. She kept filming, her expression calm, almost solemn, as if she already understood this moment was bigger than just family drama. My father cleared his throat, demanding again for me to comply, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of repetition. It was subtle, but I heard it. The first hint of strain in a man who believed he could never lose control. I let my lips press together, neither smiling nor frowning, holding my ground. Inside my purse, resting against my thigh, the folder of documents waited. I could feel the edges against my fingertips when I brushed the fabric, a reminder that I was not as defenseless as they believed. My silence was not surrender. It was preparation. The air in the room had shifted, and I could sense that the longer I waited, the more desperate they would become. And as the crowd leaned forward, straining to catch the next move, I knew the time was approaching when silence would no longer be enough, and the truth I carried would cut deeper than their accusations ever could. I rose slowly, my chair scraping against the polished floor, the sound louder than I expected in the charged silence. Every head turned toward me as I steadied my hands on the table, then reached into my purse. My fingers brushed against the folder I had carried for months, the one I had promised myself I would never need to reveal, and yet, here I was. I pulled it out, the papers thick and deliberate in my grip, and for the first time that night, my voice carried above the whispers. This property is mine, every cent earned by my work. Here is the proof. I stepped forward, my heels echoing across the ballroom as guests shifted in their chairs. The documents rustled as I unfolded them, holding them high enough for those nearby to see. Purchase agreements, bank transfers, signatures, all marked with my name and the seal of international attorneys. I handed a copy to a guest in the front row, his brows furrowing as he scanned the lines, then widening as he looked up at me with a faint nod. Another guest leaned over, whispering as he read the signature page, and the ripple of recognition spread. They were seeing the truth written in ink, undeniable and final. My father's face darkened, his jaw tightening as the color rose to his cheeks. His hands balled into fists at his sides as he spat the words that cut sharper than any accusation. "If you will not give it back, you are no longer my daughter." The room gasped collectively, a sound that seemed to shake the chandeliers above us. I felt the sting of his disowning burn across my chest, but strangely, it steadied me. I had heard variations of that rejection my whole life in the form of silence, dismissal, or mockery. Hearing it said outright in front of everyone did not break me. It confirmed what I had always known, and instead of collapsing, I felt taller. I looked directly at him, my voice calm, almost quiet compared to his rage. "You cannot erase me with words, not tonight." The guests shifted uncomfortably, some turning to one another in shock, others shaking their heads. A woman near the aisle muttered that I was brave. Another clutched her pearl's eyes wide at the audacity of my father's demand. The tide of judgment had begun to turn, and for the first time the silence no longer worked in his favor. It worked in mine. Emily tried to interject, her voice sharp with desperation, insisting that family should come before pride, that I was embarrassing them all. But the documents in front of strangers spoke louder than her protests. A man in a gray suit raised his phone slightly, taking a photo of the papers I held. Another guest whispered that the law was clear, that my father had no claim. The weight of evidence shifted the air in the room, and the certainty that had been theirs now slipped from their grasp. I felt a strange lightness, a release of the years I had carried under their shadow. The shame that had pressed on my shoulders began to lift, replaced by something fiercer. It was not just relief, it was defiance, the certainty that I had chosen the right path. I stood straighter, letting the documents rest against my chest, my chin lifted. The crowd no longer leaned forward expecting a collapse. They leaned forward, expecting a reckoning. My father's eyes burned into me, his voice cracking as he tried once more to reclaim control. "This is not over, Rachel, not by a long shot." He slammed his hand against the back of a chair, the sound jolting through the crowd. But the murmurs around him were no longer aligned with his anger. They carried doubt, sympathy, even admiration. He knew it too, and the fury in his gaze only deepened. I inhaled, steady and deliberate, feeling the storm settle inside me. The truth was on my side, and though the night was far from finished, I had crossed the line I once feared. I had stood against him, not in secret, not in silence, but in the full light of witnesses. And as his threats hung in the air, I knew he would not stop here. The fight had only shifted, and the next strike was already coming. My father straightened his shoulders, his voice slicing through the uneasy hum of the ballroom. He said he would drag me into court, that his years of connections in Boston's legal circles would guarantee my downfall. His words were sharp, filled with the authority of a man who had once wielded real influence, but to me, they sounded desperate, like someone clutching at a rope already fraying. Guests exchanged glances, a few raising their brows, as if questioning whether his threats carried the weight he wanted them to. Emily stepped closer, her veil brushing against her bouquet as she glared at me. "You are ruining my wedding, Rachel. You are selfish, always have been." She raised her voice louder so the guests could hear. "All I wanted was a perfect day, and you chose this moment to destroy it." Her accusation rang out, each word meant to paint me as the villain. I kept my eyes on her, refusing to flinch. For the first time in years, I did not look away. The crowd buzzed, whispers spilling across the tables, speculation mixing with discomfort. My heart beat steady now, not from fear, but from something stronger. I knew I had more than the truth in paper form. I had allies too. My purse vibrated against my side, the faint hum of my phone demanding attention. I pulled it out slowly, the light of the screen illuminating the name that steadied me further. David Harris. I tapped to answer, lifting the phone to speaker. His voice came through clear, confident, and loud enough to reach every corner of the hall. Rachel's ownership of the Maldives property is absolute. I have reviewed every document myself. No family member has any legal claim to her sale or profits. His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. You cannot demand division of what is not yours. A hush spread instantly, the noise of the room collapsing into silence. Guests leaned back in their chairs, eyes widening. Some gasped softly, others pressed hands to their mouths. A man near the aisle murmured that it was over. A woman whispered that the law was clear. Then, breaking the silence, a small ripple of applause rose, hesitant at first, then joined by a few more claps. My father's face twisted crimson, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles tremble. He tried to speak, but the words faltered, caught between his fury and the knowledge that he had been exposed. He slammed his fist against the table, the cutlery rattling, glasses shaking. But the sound no longer commanded respect. It sounded hollow, the act of a man who had lost his grip. Emily's expression crumbled. Her outrage turned to confusion, then to panic, as if the ground beneath her heels had shifted. She looked to my father for direction, but he had none to give. Michael, standing beside her, shifted awkwardly, his hands tightening on her bouquet, as if holding it kept him from walking away. My mother sat still, pale as marble, her eyes darting between us, lips pressed shut. I stood quietly, the phone still glowing in my hand. My chest rose and fell with deliberate calm, though inside my blood roared with the surge of vindication. For years I had been silenced, dismissed, diminished. Now, in front of witnesses who could never unsee what they had just seen, the silence broke in my favor. My father lunged forward, pointing at me with shaking hands, but no sound came. His threats had burned out. His empire of control collapsed in a single call. I let the phone drop back into my purse. The faint applause still echoing, the atmosphere shifted beyond repair. The reckoning he had tried to unleash on me had reversed, and for the first time I saw fear flicker in his eyes. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching long enough for everyone to feel it. In that stillness, I knew the night was not finished. Public humiliation was a wound he would not allow to remain open. And as the tension spread like smoke, I sensed the next consequence forming, one that would reach beyond this ballroom and into the world outside. The ballroom erupted into a chaos that no amount of music or champagne could disguise. Guests whispered openly, now their voices carrying words sharp enough for me to catch. He was wrong. She showed proof. How could a father do that? I caught snippets from different corners, as people no longer cared to hide their judgment. The hush of complicity had shattered, and the tide had turned against him. I noticed Anna lowering her phone, her face pale, yet determined. A few minutes later, I saw her tapping quickly, sending the recording off to someone else. Within moments, notifications began to buzz around the room as phones lit up on tables. I realized the scene was spreading faster than even I could have imagined. What had started as my father's stage to humiliate me was now a spectacle broadcast to the outside world. Thomas shoved his chair back so hard it toppled, the thud rattling glasses nearby. He stormed toward the exit, his polished shoes striking the marble with heavy, angry steps. People parted quickly, making way as if his rage might burn them. Heads turned to follow him, eyes narrowed with judgment. I watched him leave, his back rigid, his pride trailing behind like smoke. Emily stood abandoned near the altar, her bouquet slipping from her hands. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, staining the white lace of her gown. She sobbed openly, not the elegant tears of a bride, but the guttural cries of someone watching her perfect day unravel. Michael stood stiffly beside her, his shoulders hunched, his eyes cast down. Shame weighed him so heavily he could not look at anyone. The guests who had once clapped for their vows now avoided their gaze, unwilling to offer comfort. Linda remained seated, her hands still folded, her face pale. She did not move after Thomas left, but her eyes told me everything. She looked broken, not because she pitied me, but because the facade she had clung to for decades had collapsed in front of an audience too large to ignore. She had chosen silence for years, and now that silence had left her with nothing to defend. I gathered my purse and jacket, my movement steady, almost ritualistic. I could feel Mark at my side, his presence grounding me, his hand brushing against mine. He reached down and clasped my hand firmly, and together, we began to walk toward the doors. Each step felt like cutting a path through the ruins of what had once been my family's perfect image. Guests stepped aside, some nodding, subtly, others murmuring words that reached my ears in fragments. "You did the right thing. Don't regret it. Be strong." Those quiet reassurances slipped into me like small anchors, reminding me that I was not as alone as my father had tried to make me believe. As we passed the tables, I noticed several guests still scrolling on their phones, watching the video replay of my father's outburst and David's voice over the speaker confirming the truth. Their expressions were a mixture of shock and fascination. By tomorrow, I knew the clip would spread far beyond this ballroom, and the story would no longer belong to my family alone. We reached the doors, the golden handles gleaming under the lights, and I paused just long enough to glance back. Emily was crumpled against a chair, her gown wrinkled, her makeup smeared, her voice lost beneath her sobs. Michael hovered helplessly, unable to salvage what had been destroyed. Linda still sat with her head bowed, trapped between loyalty and shame. The scene etched itself into me like a painting of downfall, the kind that could never be erased. I pushed the doors open, the cool night air rushing in to meet me. The hum of the city outside was indifferent, the traffic rolling on, life continuing, as if the collapse of my family was just another secret spilled into the world. Mark squeezed my hand once more as we stepped into the street. Behind us, the music had stopped, the laughter had died, and the perfect wedding had disintegrated into scandal. I thought the night might end there with the wreckage left behind us. But as the glow of phones lit the sidewalks outside, and strangers already whispered about the video they had just seen, I understood this was only the beginning of the fallout, and the consequences would spread far beyond that ballroom. The morning after the wedding, my phone buzzed nonstop. Colleagues, old friends, even people I had not spoken to in years sent me the same link. The video Anna had recorded had spread overnight. It showed my father demanding money, Emily backing him, the ballroom gasping, and finally David's voice cutting through to confirm my ownership. Within hours, it was everywhere, shared in neighborhood groups, reposted on social media pages, whispered about in coffee shops across Boston. By the second day, local reporters had picked it up. They described the fall of Thomas Morgan, once a respected attorney now remembered for trying to strip his daughter of what was rightfully hers. His old colleagues released statements distancing themselves. Former clients left scathing comments questioning his integrity. Friends who once sat proudly at his table stopped returning his calls. The name he had worked decades to polish was stained in a matter of days. Emily disappeared from the spotlight she had craved. Instead of a honeymoon, she locked herself away in their condo, her husband Michael seen leaving alone on several mornings. The tabloids speculated about a marriage already cracked. Pictures surfaced of Emily looking distraught, mascara running once again, only this time on city streets. Invitations she once flaunted dried up. No one wanted the stain of association. I returned to the hospital, slipping into my scrubs and the familiar rhythm of 12-hour shifts. My colleagues greeted me with quiet nods, some with open admiration. A few whispered that they had seen the video and that I had shown strength they could never imagine. Patients smiled at me, some recognizing me, thanking me for standing tall. I carried on with my work, steady hands treating those who needed me, the storm outside the hospital walls kept at bay by the certainty of my purpose. At night, I sat with Mark in our apartment overlooking the Charles River, the lights of Boston stretching across the water. He would squeeze my hand and remind me that none of this had been my fault. I had done what was necessary, and for once, the truth had been seen by everyone, not hidden in the corners of our family home. For the first time in years, I felt light, not because the battle was easy, but because it was finally visible. My father stayed silent after his outburst, no longer threatening lawsuits or meetings. His law license became the subject of investigation, and whispers of past dealings began to surface. The man who had believed he was untouchable now avoided stepping outside, fearful of the stares that followed him. His downfall did not come from me alone, but from the truth he had tried to bury and the arrogance of believing he could twist it to his will. I thought often about my mother, still caught between loyalty and shame. She sent no messages, made no calls, but I could imagine her sitting in that quiet house, wondering if silence had been worth the price. Perhaps one day she would reach out. Perhaps not. For now, I accepted that some wounds would never be healed. As for me, I held on to my work, my marriage, and the knowledge that I had stood firm when it mattered. The property I sold in the Maldives was no longer just an investment. It was a symbol that I had carved something of my own, against odds, against dismissal, against betrayal. No one could take that away. Justice did not arrive in a courtroom or through drawn-out battles. It arrived in the simple exposure of truth, in the courage to stand under the lights and refuse to bend. I learned that sometimes the greatest victory is not in revenge, but in reclaiming the dignity that was denied. This story is not just about money. It is about the right to be respected, even by those who swore they loved you. And now I want to turn to you. Have you ever been forced to stand alone against your own family to fight for what was rightfully yours, whether it was respect, love, or something more tangible? Share your story with me in the comments. I would like to hear how you found your strength, because sometimes telling the truth out loud is the first step to justice.